Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 37 of Truth is Justice. Last episode, we looked at Bob's so-called putting the microscope on Sandra, or at least that was Bob's claims. The reality, as we demonstrated, was quite the opposite. Instead of asking and answering the difficult questions that Jim deserved to have asked, the interview Bob conducted with Jim Fitzgerald was more intended by Bob to be a public relations exercise for Sandra and the Free Sandy movement. It didn't quite come off as Bob had hoped, with Jim raising some very valid points during the interview that Bob had to move on from very quickly. Bob went on several minutes-long speeches in defence of Sandra and asked only those questions and made only those points that he felt would prompt an answer or commentary from Jim that would be positive for Sandra in some way. Now, defenders of Bob's approach to the interview, by not providing Jim with any background on the case and expressing his joy that Jim had little knowledge of the case, defenders of that approach suggest that it ensured that Jim only focused on the interview and was not biased by anything else. With the right guest, that may work. A world-renowned specialist in body language analysis or voice analysis or eye movement analysis, for example. Those specialists in kinesics and oculesics, would have been able to view that video in isolation and achieve something from it. Whilst Jim no doubt has learned how to read people's reactions over his many years at the FBI, and he made mention of Sandra's closing up and going into her shell towards the end of the interview, he was quite open in acknowledging that he would need to review the entire case file and ask plenty of follow-up questions to perform a proper analysis. He noted that his skills and his experience relied on access to information. And without that, he reflected on how sometimes people he thought were innocent whilst interviewing them turned out to be guilty, and vice versa. It all hinges on information, something that Bob was seemingly very reluctant to provide. So, to the defenders of that approach of Bob's, even Jim Fitzgerald noted he needed access to the information. So those defenders would need to accept that, at best, Bob made a mistake in either the selection of the person he chose to do the interview, or a mistake in not giving Jim all the case information, and at worst, was deliberately trying to limit the fallout from the interview and somehow protect Sandra as much as possible. So what we thought would be good to do, in response to Bob's failure to really put Sandra under any scrutiny at all, over the next 2 episodes we'll look at Sandra's police interview with the consideration of some elements that a body language and behavioural analyst may consider relevant, and also to raise those questions that would have been truly relevant if Bob was interested in getting to the truth. We will put the microscope on Sandra, and you will likely see the difference between what Bob did and what he claimed he did. The reality is, those questions should have been asked by Bob before he so confidently joined the Free Sandy movement, because, in my view, if he asked those questions, he wouldn't have been so quick to take a position on the case based solely on what was said by Sandra's friends and family. If Bob really had taken that extra step and asked the difficult questions and demanded answers, 2 things could have happened. If Sandra had provided answers to those questions, and those answers were appropriate and fit with the narrative, then that could have been helpful for Sandra's PR campaign. If the answers given, or not given, were such that it raised more questions, then Jim's memory would have been properly honoured. Importantly, in either scenario, the truth and a full understanding of what happened in the lead up to Jim's murder, that evening on the 22nd of December 2012, and the months following it, would have been much closer to being understood. And that's the difference, I suppose, between having a predetermined mindset, as Bob did, and as a result, a mindset then taken on by many of his most devout followers, and being guided by the evidence. When we move on to our next case, which we are preparing for now, you will observe the difference. The case we're going to cover is an interesting one, and we will pull apart the details of it just as we have with this case. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. You might remember a number of weeks back that I raised whether Sandra was wearing contact lenses or glasses following being discovered by Herman and Maria on the 23rd of December 2012. This question was prompted by an excellent post by Danielle on our Facebook page a couple of months ago now. The conversation that flowed from Danielle's post was an interesting one, and if you have a chance to look over it, I'd encourage you to do so. The question of what Sandra was using for her eyesight is relevant, in terms of the police interview specifically, for a number of reasons. And I think, had Jim Fitzgerald been given access to all of the case material, he likely would have raised a few interesting questions about this particular matter. First, a quick background on the contact lenses and glasses situation. We've heard that Sandra would wear contacts and glasses at different times. She was wearing glasses during her interview with KHOU from prison, and she was wearing glasses during her trial. In some of the photos we have seen with her family, she's wearing glasses, including in the one taken at the airport just before Liz boarded her flight after her last trip to Houston before Jim's murder. We also know from the nearly 1,000 photos taken of the Melgar's home by the crime scene unit Mr. Carpenter that Sandra's glasses were found on top of her clothing matching what she was wearing or what she claims to have worn for the dinner that evening with Jim at Los Cucos. And we also know that Sandra wore contact lenses. A contact lens case can be seen in the photos taken of the master bathroom, and in Sandra's robe, the robe she was wearing when, according to her narrative, she was attacked by supposed intruders, in the robe pocket were contact lens drops and artificial tears drops. The location of the glasses is important. In fact, I recall a scenario offered up by those proclaiming Sandra's innocence that the glasses match a position where they would have been found if Sandra was sitting on a chair in the master bathroom closet and when was hit, causing the glasses to fall from her head onto the clothes that she had taken off shortly before, supposedly, entering the jacuzzi. If you accept that position, then it would likely suggest that Sandra wasn't wearing contacts when she was attacked, meaning for her glasses to be found on top of her clothes and the contact lens drops and artificial tears drops to be found in her robe. If you accept that Sandra really was attacked, then she either wasn't wearing contacts or glasses during her police interview, or she put them in at some time after her discovery by Herman and Maria. Now that step never appears in her narrative, or the narrative told by Herman and Maria, nor does it appear in the report or the testimony of Deputy Martinez. Now turning now to the police interview. Now it's clear, obviously, that Sandra isn't wearing glasses during the interview. What you will also notice is that Sandra appears to be able to function perfectly well, completely unhindered by poor eyesight. For example, she can reach across directly for the small cup of water and place it on the desk without trouble. And at the beginning of the interview, Sandra can be seen looking at her ankles and even appearing to take a glance up at the recording camera in the corner of the room. That is at about the 9:45 and 54 second mark of the video. Now, while she doesn't make eye contact too frequently with the detectives, she does appear to do so quite easily. Now, a quick side note. We've heard from Sandra's family members that Sandra's hearing was quite bad, to the point that she would rely on lip reading. Now that line, that piece of information, is often used to explain how Sandra could carry on a 2-hour romantic conversation with Jim in the jacuzzi over the noise of the jets. Jets that are claimed to have been so loud that they prevented Sandra hearing anything going on between Jim and the supposed intruders. So, back to the interview. It seems reasonably clear that Sandra's eyesight wasn't a problem for her during that interview. And that leads to an important question that could have been asked of Sandra by Bob or one of the family members as part of Bob's reinvestigation. The question could have been, were you wearing contacts during that police interview? And if so, when did you manage to put them in? Now, if Sandra was wearing the contacts prior to the supposed intruders attacking her, then that step is absent in all of her given narratives and would appear to make quite puzzling the discovery of her glasses on top of her clothes. If she put them in after being discovered, then again, her narrative makes no mention of it. In fact, we have quite detailed descriptions of her movements, including changing her soiled underwear and her multiple trips to the toilet, where, presumably, that was where she ended up with a visible amount of feces on her fingers and her fingernails. It would seem unlikely that she would be comfortable then putting in contact lenses with the risk of infection, given the state of her fingers. We also know that Sandra read and signed consent forms, as described by Mr. Carpenter in his trial testimony. So, we have the puzzling situation of her eyesight and the contact. And one explanation, which would be presumably vigorously challenged by the Free Sandy movement, is that Sandra was wearing contacts when she was discovered by Herman and Maria, and that she had put them in sometime shortly before her discovery. That would obviously be quite damning for her. Not only does it then make the glasses on top of the clothes almost certainly an element of staging, but it also would virtually eliminate any intruder argument. The only innocent possibility that comes to mind is that Sandra put in her contacts sometime after returning home from Los Cucos. It would seem unlikely that she would put her contacts in prior to going to bed, even if she was planning on further romance, and her narrative doesn't seem to provide an opportunity for her to do it prior to entering the jacuzzi. It really does throw up a very interesting series of questions that any focus on the truth would require. My personal suspicion is that Sandra was wearing contacts during her interview, and she put those in some time prior to her discovery by Herman and Maria. I suggest that it would have been almost essential for her to have her contacts or glasses on for her to be able to apply those restraints to herself, if her eyesight was indeed as poor as has been suggested. The topic of the restraints brings me to the second point, Sandra's physical condition during the interview. Now, many of you will recall my demonstrations of self-applying the restraints in the way which Bob and the Free Sandy movement now suggest Sandra's arms were restrained. The main way Bob dismisses the relevance of my demonstrations is to point to the physical differences between Sandra and myself. He does this by referring to Sandra's shoulder surgery, her hip replacements, her arthritis, all the various physical ailments. I actually think that position is problematic for Sandra, for various reasons. First, on the position of Sandra's arms, we've covered this in detail before, so I won't go too much into it now, but I think it's more than likely that Sandra's hands were restrained in the exact way that Ms. Barnett and Maria Melgar described and demonstrated at trial. But if we entertain for a minute the idea that her hands were restrained with her hands at the opposing elbow, then her condition upon her discovery and during her police interview is very interesting. You recall Bob noting that he was unable to place his arms into that position, and that even his wife, a fitness professional, was unable to do so for any period of time. I even recall Bob being reluctant to perform a full demonstration of those restraints on his wife at risk of causing her permanent injury. So consider then that Sandra, a woman we are told required regular strong pain medication and suffered from very serious physical ailments, consider that less than 20 minutes after being released from restraints that she claims she was in, per her narrative, for 16 hours or more, is more or less unharmed physically from that experience. She had, according to her narrative, no access to pain medication, and yet within minutes she functioned seemingly perfectly well. Now think of a situation where you have been in an uncomfortable position physically for a period of time. Now for me, driving long distances, so 10, 12 or 14 or more hours, even with breaks, can leave me uncomfortable, and that is sitting in a natural position in a comfortable chair. I had the benefit of speaking with someone recently who had received training which entailed an element of restraint and being kept in an uncomfortable position for hours at a time. This person is fit and healthy and with no significant physical issues. They described to me the feeling of being restrained awkwardly for a period of time. Now, even with adrenaline surging through their body, it would be impossible for them to function well physically, even hours after being released, let alone minutes. Now, by way of another example, think about some of the horrors suffered by those who have been subjected to torture in the form of being kept in an uncomfortable body position for hours. It's obviously seen as a very effective torture technique because we hear stories about it being used extensively in various situations. Think about having to lie in small boxes or stand in small spaces. Now, you do a Google search on stress position torture and you'll see the details and effects. Specific examples out of Guantanamo Bay include detainees subjected to physically stressful positions, unable to stand fully upright and confined horizontally to small spaces. and documents suggest that periods of up to 3 days were authorised as part of that torture routine. Now, 3 days in a physically stressful position for a person potentially young, fit, and perhaps highly motivated to not be deterred by physical stress. In my opinion, this highlights how extraordinary Sandra's resilience to her period of restraint was. Now, psychologically, the impact is described as being far worse than the physical pain and injury, hence why it's an effective torture tool. Now, there's been commentary by Bob and others that Sandra could have died in that master bathroom closet if she wasn't found. I completely disagree with those suggestions, but if that was truly the case, imagine the psychological impact that would ordinarily have on an individual. Yet, we see a woman in good physical, and I argue mental health, remaining composed and largely unaffected. Even on a fit, strong, young body, the consequences physically and mentally of that ordeal would be very significant. For Sandra, and the position her supporters like Bob claim her arms were kept in, when I did my demonstrations, after a short time, so an hour or so, I could feel the beginnings of the negative physical impact. Sandra, after 16 hours or more of having her arms restrained in a position that even Bob describes as being very difficult and painful for people to manoeuvre into, after 16 plus hours of that, Sandra is able to use the restroom by herself effectively, wash her hands, and even sign a consent form. She's able to reach out and grab a small cup and gently place it down on the table, all seemingly without any negative repercussions from her significant period of time in the restraints. Further, she makes virtually no suggestion of being in any discomfort from those restraints. No request for pain medication for her shoulders or back, no massaging of her shoulders to reduce the pain, nothing. Unfortunately, once again, this was an area where Jim Fitzgerald could have given an interesting take on Sandra's observable physical condition during her police interview. I suggest that Sandra's general overall composure, as noted by Jim, would have been put in a very interesting context if he was directly presented with a scenario of how Sandra's supporters claim her arms were restrained. If you have the opportunity to watch the police interview again, take note of some of Sandra's movements with her arms, and note how they appear to be free and not impaired in any way. I suggest that either she has an extraordinary ability to handle physical pain that would ordinarily bring sufferers of torture to breaking point, and a body that was in such prime physical condition that it could withstand that treatment for 16 plus hours and not interfere with her arm movements in any noticeable way, and yet at the same time be a woman who requires strong prescription-only pain medication, and a contemplation and interest in using marijuana, or the alternative, which I think is far more likely, that she was restrained only for a very short period of time in the far more comfortable position described and demonstrated at trial by Maria Melgar, and that she likely benefited from the use of pain medication sometime shortly prior to her discovery. Now, if you still cannot quite grasp the enormity of what that restraint and those conditions would have done, perform the demonstration yourself without going to the point of applying restraints. Cross your arms behind your back for as long as you can, an added dimension of lying on the ground with pressure on one shoulder, per Sandra's description, will add some realism. Now imagine being kept in that position, without water, without pain medication, and then being able to use your arms without impairment 16 hours later. Then imagine a woman with Sandra's claimed physical ailments withstanding that. This case has so many elements that I believe point towards Sandra's narrative being impossible. So many elements that point to her guilt. For me, this is a very powerful one. One that I don't think can be reasonably explained by Sandra's supporters or by Bob. It's another situation where a claimed element of her defence, her supposed multiple serious health issues, cause her a big problem when you apply those same conditions to a restraint scenario that would have even elite soldiers suffering negatively from. I don't think it's too bold to say that the way Sandra appears physically in that police interview is entirely, completely inconsistent with someone who has had their arms tied behind their back for 16 plus hours and only released a matter of hours before we observe her on video. I'm going to leave it there for this week and continue with the body language analysis aspects of Sandra's interview next week. Thank you for listening to Truth is Justice. We look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.
Thank you. Bye.